I'm so excited I get to finally start building the benchwork for my layout. Hi friends, my name is Steven and this is my channel Signal Up Productions, where I make videos all about trains. Now in the last video we discussed how I designed the track plan. In this video I'm going to show you the different techniques and processes that I used for building the benchwork. But before I get started, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, then click that bell icon so you're notified every time I post a new video. Let's take a moment to talk about power tool safety. In this video you're going to see me use a variety of power tools. This video is not meant to be a demonstration on the proper use of those tools, so it's your responsibility to read and fully understand the manuals that come with your power tools and to use them safely. That's your responsibility. This video is not showing you, it's not a how-to video on power tool usage. So be sure and understand how to use your power tools, and if you don't, then maybe stick with hand tools. Why don't we take a look at that track plan? We'll develop a list of materials that we need, then jump in the van and head over to the hardware store. I designed the layout to be built in sections just in case I ever needed to move it. I wanted to minimize the number of sections, and I planned their joints to avoid any switches. What I created then was a plan that used 4 sections of benchwork. The end sections containing the curves are 3 feet by 5.5 feet. The middle sections are 18 inches wide by 9 feet long. I thoroughly tested these dimensions before cutting a single piece of wood. I wanted to make darn sure the sections weren't too big to move into or out of my space. Even then, after the first section was assembled, I carried it down to the basement and set it up just to see for myself that it fit as planned. These dimensions totaled 60 square feet of plywood for the top. For that, I'll need 2 sheets of plywood. I also would like to use plywood ripped into strips for the open grid frame. I'll need about 80 linear feet of board ripped to about 3.5 inches wide, so that'll take an entire other sheet of plywood. For the legs, I plan on using 2x2s. To get those, I'll rip those from a common 2x4. One 8-foot 2x4 will yield the 4 legs needed for one section. That means I need to put 4 of the 2x4s on the shopping list. Because plywood is only 8 feet long, I'm going to need some common 1x6 pine boards since they're available in 10-foot lengths. That's for the side rails of the middle sections, the 10-foot lengths, and then I'll just cut that down to be the 9-foot for those sections. Now plywood is made from many thin layers of wood that are glued together. Now trying to screw into the ends of these ripped boards, they're going to cause those layers to split. For that reason, I plan on gluing the wood parts together and using 1.5 inch long finishing nails to pin things together with the nail gun until the glue dries. The frame, that's going to be simple straight boards, but I still want some contours with a landform. To give these elevated areas a finished edge, I'll add masonite fascia to the outside of the frame on each section. Finally, I'll need some bolts, some T-nuts, washers for the legs, and bolts for holding the sections together. Now that I've got the shopping list all together, let's jump in the van and head to the store. I like shopping for lumber at Menards. The closest store for me is about an hour away. I'm going to use the 5/8 inch thick sanded plywood. I'm going to spend a little extra time picking through the pile to make sure I find the best sheets. Once I had everything that was on the shopping list, I loaded it into the back of my wife's van and promptly headed home so I could get started. Full plywood sheets are a lot to handle by myself. I wish I had somebody to help, but I didn't at this particular day I was doing this. If you've got someone to help, it's going to make life a lot easier. If not, you're in for a workout. I'll be cutting the larger pieces for the benchwork top using my circular saw. To do this and not risk striking the blade on the ground, I laid down a couple of thick pieces of styrofoam and placed the plywood on top of that. Then I checked to see if the plywood sheets were square by measuring corner to corner. Then I used my T-square to start making out the lines for each of the different pieces. I spent time during the planning phase figuring out how best to use the plywood with as little waste as possible. I had those plans written down and transferred those measurements onto the plywood with pencil. Be mindful of your work area, especially when using power tools. I want to enjoy hearing and seeing my trains, so I used ear and eye protection every time I made a cut. For the frame parts, I cut the last sheet of plywood in half using the circular saw. Then I set up my table saw with a couple of extra work tables. This made it a lot easier to rip the larger pieces. I set the rip fence to 3.5 inches wide and started feeding the sheets through. Once I had the frame pieces ripped, I used the miter saw to cut the boards to length, then started setting them into position. Using the nail gun and a 90-degree clamp, I was able to quickly pin the frame together. For some of the sections, I needed to attach the top before all of the cross members were in place. Then I'd flip the section upside down and got accurate measurements for each of the individual cross members, installing them one at a time. Some of the cross members had to avoid areas where the turntable or switch motors were going, so I measured accurately to ensure those weren't obstructed. At this point, apparently I lost the clips of installing the legs in the leg pockets. But basically, I ripped the 2x4s long ways into strips of 2 by 2 inches, then I cut those in half to be about 4 feet long each. But the legs only needed to be about 44 inches long, since that's how high I wanted the layout. Using the leftover pieces that were trimmed off the 4-foot long pieces, that left me about a 4-inch long piece, I made a pocket with that piece, plus some leftover sections of the ripped plywood from earlier. These got installed in a corner of the frame, adjusting their position as needed to get a good fit with the leg. Once these were glued and nailed into place, I marked each leg and pocket with a letter for that section and a number for each pocket. Then I drilled holes through the layout frame and the leg to accommodate the bolt that will hold the leg into place. The leg itself got a T-nut on the back side of the hole. The bottom of the leg also got a hole drilled and a T-nut installed for the leveling carriage bolts that I'll use to level the legs later. For the long middle section that will include the river scene, I used the 1x6 boards to allow a notch to be cut out without weakening the overall structure. I narrow these boards down on the ends to match the 3.5 inch wide ripped plywood boards that are going to be used for the cross members. I cut all 4 of these side rails to 9 feet long. I placed all 4 on top of one another to ensure they were the exact same length. I found that some were just a hair too long, so I matched up one end, then clamped them together and used a belt sander to shave off the excess. While the river boards were still clamped together, I used the jigsaw to notch out the river area. I ripped the masonite sheets into strips of 4 inches wide and 8 inches wide. The perimeter of each section was covered with one of these strips, based on whether the scenery was going to be flat or hilly in that particular area. The pieces that were 8 inches wide were used for the hilly areas, giving me room to cut the wavy line above the layout surface. I attached the masonite to the side of the layout frame using liquid nails glue and some finishing nails from the nail gun. Seams where pieces met together, as well as the small nail holes, were filled in with spackle, and then I sanded those smooth. Then I painted all the masonite a flat black latex paint. I realize that this paint may get a little messy down the road when I start the scenery process, but in the meantime it'll give a nice look to the layout until I can get some scenery done. While the black paint was still drying, I went down to the basement and mixed up some blue craft paint I had laying around with some leftover eggshell white latex paint that we had from a previous project. That saved me from buying a separate whole gallon of blue paint. I hoped that mixing the two would get me pretty close to a sky blue, which I think it did. I was having a little fun rolling the paint onto the basement walls. While these sections were still in my workshop, I went ahead and drilled several holes in the cross members in the middle. These are going to be used later for the wiring. I used a large wood bit, then some of it chipped off on the back side of the plywood when I drilled all the way through. So I used a wire brush to clean up the back side, the wood chips there, the splinters, to avoid getting any splinters in my hand. After all the benchwork was built, painted, and test fit together, my wife and I disassembled everything and moved it down to the basement. There, I adjusted the leveling bolts on the bottom of the legs until everything was perfect. Then I used C-clamps to hold the sections together while I drilled large holes in the frames where they met. Then I used large bolts and washers to tighten everything together. I was concerned that the black paint I used for the fascia would end up sticking together where the two sections meet. If I ever needed to take them apart, the paint could fuse those together, making it difficult to separate. So before I clamped the sections together, I inserted some wax paper into the joints and ripped it off flush with the top. With the benchwork now in place, I'll get started transferring the track plan to the plywood top. I'm eager to get the track and wiring complete, so at least I can start running trains, but that's for the next video, so be sure you are subscribed to my channel so you're notified as soon as I get that uploaded. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, be sure and leave those in the comment section down below. And just as a last reminder, there's lots of different ways of doing benchwork for model railroads. This is just one way. This is my way based on years of experience of what works best for me. So be sure and research if you're looking at ways of doing different benchwork. And I'm thinking about making a video that just discusses all the different options for benchwork. If you're interested in seeing me make that video, be sure and leave a comment down below. See you guys on the next video.